Secret guardians, starry bright, fiery ones beyond our sight, saints of yore, Buddhas too, guiding lights to me and you.
Chapter 11. Etheric Realm over Shanghai, China. Theatre Anteroom of the Jade Temple. May, 1999. That night, my etheric body left my physical form, which was deep asleep in my lonely apartment. I found myself sitting lotus-style in the room where I had met the saint with the blue-violet eyes. Again, as before, I was aware of others in the room, but I dared not take my focus from what was before me. Stretched as far as I could see was what appeared to be a theatre screen, but was much more like a window into a parallel world called Akasha, where I have come to learn all of history is recorded. Don't ask me how. I'm just a rememberer. I later came to know the Jade Temple as a place the saints used to minister to souls who had suffered overwhelming traumas in their most recent lives. As one might imagine from the current state of affairs on Earth, the temple was a busy place. Not a few saints and their attending angels worked there. I somehow knew I was here because of my parents. I longed for word of them. Thankfully, the room's jade walls seemed to release a frequency that soothed the very depths of me, allowing me to watch the difficult unfolding scenes with a measure of detachment that I couldn't have managed otherwise. The screen came alive. Chapter 12. Long An Province, Republic of Vietnam. 5th Brigade Area of Operations. Akashic Record, April 1970. Bracing against the fast-sinking sun, Corporal Sean Burns' squad moved through an area of defoliated scrub toward a distant tree line. Bandoliers of 7.62mm M60 ammunition and loaded M16 rifle magazines draped the soldier's chest. A claymore mine in its olive drab pouch, 3 frag grenades, and a canteen hung from the web belt around his waist. He carried his M16 assault rifle with both hands. Despite a drizzling rain, sweat stung his eyes and soaked his sun-bleached fatigues. New in country, and not yet acclimated to the brutal tropical heat, Sean struggled to keep up with his squad leader, Sergeant Jesse Reyes, who had taken point. From the noises behind him, Sean figured others in the squad were in the same boat. To the east, he could make out a series of flooded rice paddies. A forlorn hut made of bamboo and thatch held sway over its rice kingdom from a spit of raised earth bisecting 2 of the paddies. Barely visible wisps of smoke rose from the hut. The 10-man squad had been inserted by a helicopter into a no-man's land a dozen kilometers west of its sprawling Cu Chi base camp, home to the US Army's 25th Infantry Division. In the evening twilight, Sean's squad was hurrying away from their landing zone to set up at an ambush site assigned to them by their company commander back at Cu Chi. Once they cleared the landing zone, Reyes marched his squad west for a good half hour before signalling a halt. By training, the men fanned out to create a defensive perimeter around their position. Reyes motioned forward Sean and another soldier, who was carrying the squad's radio. "We step easy here," Reyes said in a low voice, pointing to the woodsy area they were about to traverse. "Burn, stay 15 on my tail, weapon and eyes right." Sean nodded. 15 meters exact, not 10, not 20. Sean nodded again. "Eddie, you 5 behind Irish," Reyes said, referring to Sean's nickname among the squad. "Keep an eye on him." Radio man Eddie Johnson nodded in reply. By virtue of his time in the field, Reyes had recently earned the rank of sergeant and was now an assistant platoon leader. But Sean knew that Reyes' promotion meant little to him. Infinitely more important to the newly minted sergeant was his short-timer status, with only 5 weeks of his 12-month Vietnam tour left to serve. Over warm beers back at Cu Chi, Sean had heard the Boston native's story, which was not at all that different from the stories of other young grunts he'd met. Dragooned into the army as a draftee after dropping out of college, Reyes had been assigned to the Army's infantry school at Fort Polk, Louisiana after basic training, and after a month's leave upon graduation, had shipped out directly to Vietnam. Reyes had been ready to go home the day he arrived at Cu Chi. Now he was beyond ready. Still kneeling, Reyes pulled a laminated map from his ruck and studied it. 6 is a blood-sucking leech, he said to no one in particular. Doesn't know his head from his ass dropping us in here this late. The comment startled Sean, who was still learning the nuances of the deadly search and destroy game the US Army played with its enemy. Disciplined North Vietnamese Army units infiltrating South Vietnam along the Ho Chi Minh Trail like relentless ants. Jesse, radio's talking. Buku NVA, where we're supposed to set up, Johnson said. Along the march, the cocky 19-year-old from Lansing, Michigan, had been monitoring radio chatter among other units operating in the vicinity. Reyes eyed Johnson, but didn't offer a reply. The radio man continued. It'd be suicide crazy to set up on Mr. Charles Trail. Every gook for miles around heard us incoming. Papa San over there is already sending smoke signals. Johnson pointed to the rice farmer's hut in the distance. I got that Custer vibe, Jesse. Without replying, Reyes shouldered his ruck and picked up his rifle. Saddle up. The sergeant turned toward a raised earthen berm on the horizon and began moving out. No one said a word, but they all knew what he was up to. As Sean shouldered his gear, his eyes fixed on a towering tree outlined in the western horizon. His imagination flashed on an NVA spotter up high in that tree. The spotter would have a dominating view of the surrounding terrain. Sarge, Sean said. That tall tree, over there, it's a banyan. They're easy to climb, so, you know. For an intense moment, Reyes studied the distant tree, then turned to survey an overgrown area in the opposite direction. Good call, Irish, he said softly. Without another word, he turned the squad east, until they disappeared into elephant grass out of sight of any NVA that might be watching them from the Sentinel Banyan. By the time the squad arrived via its detour to the high ground, twilight had turned to night. The squad set out and armed their claymore mines, facing toward the 2 most likely approaches to their location. The men spread out along one side of the berm and settled in for a miserable night under a dripping sky. Sean looked up from his position on the squad's right flank. A sliver of a new moon struggled to break through the heavy cloud cover, and then just as quickly disappeared. Still monitoring his radio, Johnson passed on reports of a company-sized enemy element moving through their area of operations. This spooked the squad, especially Sean. He knew they would be outgunned in any firefight, and it would be next to impossible to call in air support, thanks to the thick overcast. Sergeant Reyes didn't know where precisely his squad was, making any fire support they might need from Cu Chi a dicey proposition. He'd need map coordinates to call in artillery fire, and while he had some idea where they were in the grid, he wasn't totally sure. Still, He and his men would take their chances lying alongside a rain-slicked rice paddy berm instead of straddling a branch of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where enemy contact was all but assured. If Johnson's radio was telling the truth. The sergeant took first watch along with Sean. The rest of the men balled up their poncho liners as best they could, trying to minimise the mosquito bites and catch some sleep for their strung-out bodies.
Alone with his thoughts, Sean again found himself beyond chagrined at his own naive wanderlust that had brought him to this suffering land.
Not much had changed here over time, he knew. The little Vietnamese people farmed and lived on rice and fish, and not much else. They chewed betel nut for comfort. They raised families and had dreams and ambitions for their children, as all did. And they suffered and died in war. Sean's mind turned to how he came to know these things. It was barely a year ago, in the spring of 1969, while attending McGill University in Montreal. With the help of a study abroad scholarship he'd received for being the top student in his class, he'd gone to Canada from Belfast. At McGill, he'd read everything he could find on Vietnamese culture and history. After all, the country was a not-so-distant cousin to Tibet, the land of his birth, and it was a topic that dominated the news. He'd even researched the distance between Saigon and Lhasa, roughly 1,500 miles by air, 1,670 miles over land. However, book learning hadn't satisfied him. He had to go see for himself. He had always been that way. So, while some draft-age Americans were fleeing north to Canada to avoid military service and the chance of going to Vietnam, this young Irish student went south. With his Irish passport in hand, he secured a tourist visa to visit the States. From Montreal, he took a bus to New York, crossing the Peace Bridge into downtown Buffalo. From the Greyhound bus terminal, he immediately walked the 24 blocks to the nearest US Army recruiting office. Within 6 weeks, he was taking US Army basic training at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Less than half a year later, on New Year's Day 1970, he found himself boarding a Boeing 707 with 140 other wide-eyed soldiers for the 24-hour flight from Fort Lewis, Washington, to Tan Son Nhut Air Base near Saigon. Sean recalled the other soldiers' faces, some stoic, others cocky masks. But underneath there was always foreboding, the tells etched in tense jawlines and worried eyes. He remembered thinking that in a year's time, some would come home whole, others maimed, and still others in flag-draped boxes. All would return forever changed, he'd realised. Sean sensed then, but he knew for a fact now, that he too would come home a different man. But why was he the guy who just had to climb to the edge of the rumbling, belching volcano to peer down its throat while all other sentient life fled down its mountainside? Somehow, he'd been drawn to this suffering land by a yearning to understand the heart of darkness. Maybe if he better understood the evil that stalked the planet, he could do something about it. A naive idea, perhaps. But still, he believed he had to try. But now, hunkering down on a patch of Southeast Asian mud, in the dead of night and praying to avoid contact with an unseen enemy that would most certainly end in blood, Sean again rued the day he'd been so stupid as to volunteer to stick his head into the jaws of the beast. The rain had slowed almost to a stop, but a thickening fog meant that each squad member hidden next to the berm couldn't see the soldier next to him. The night was so dark, Sean and the rest of Rhea's squad might as well have been in an underground cave. The complete darkness would be a blessing or a curse. The squad was virtually invisible, But if the enemy came their way, then the squad's watch wouldn't see them until they were almost upon them. They'd hear movement before they'd see anything. That made the sounds of the night all the more important for Jian to discern. But in his drained state, he found it impossible to tell the real from the imagined. He was fighting exhaustion from lack of sleep and the stress of combat operations. His feet were soaked inside his boots, and were probably in the initial stages of jungle rot. Incessant mosquitoes were feasting on every exposed part of his body. He was pulling watch, supposedly with Reyes, while the others tried to grab some sleep. But Jian suspected that down the line, the squad leader too had succumbed to exhaustion and was now asleep. Faint metal-on-metal sounds drifted out from the empty night, like gear shifting on marching men. Each sound triggered a bolt of fear within Jian. He struggled to focus, his mind imagining enemy soldiers silently creeping toward him. Jian woke dreaming of a ghost patrol of North Vietnamese troops, walking right through the squad's position. He must have nodded off, but for how long? Shaking off his grogginess, he heard unmistakable sounds in the distance. An enemy force was nearby, and moving through. They were apparently avoiding the area's well-known trails, just as Reyes had done. Jian prayed the column would pass by. Dread swept over him. Hell would rain down if he triggered an ambush. There was no telling how many NVA were there. The unit could be a small resupply squad, a platoon, or an entire combat company. Because he was on the squad's right flank closest to the sounds, Jian could not chance crawling down the line to alert the next in line squad member. The enemy was too close and might hear his movement, and by the growing sounds they were closing on the squad's position. If he had to blow the ambush, he would have to do it alone. The realization terrified him. And then the clouds let loose, and rain slashed down, drumming the muddy berm like a million tears from on high. Out of the foggy blackness, a shadowy form materialized. Jian's entire being froze. His heart pumped wildly as adrenaline coursed through him. He had staged 2 grenades at the ready. His spare magazines were within reach, and dry under his poncho liner. The trudging ghost took on definition. Bent forward and shouldering a rucksack that seemed to dwarf him, the column's point man picked his way along the berm, his AK-47 rifle slung over his left shoulder. By the time Jian saw him, the soldier had passed beyond the kill zone of one of the deployed Claymore mines. He was leading the enemy column directly across the berm. They would pass within feet of the squad. There would be no passing quietly this night. Trying to control his trembling, Jian flipped off the safety of his M16, aimed its muzzle at the point man's chest and suppressed the trigger for a millisecond. 3 5.56mm rounds shredded the man's torso, not 5 meters away. He let out a gurgled cry and fell toward Jian, bleeding out and dying. Instinct and training took over. A second man ghosted into view. Jian retargeted onto him and emptied the rest of his magazine toward him. The soldier jerked and fell backward. Jian then triggered the claymores and started arching grenades as far down the berm as he could throw, or at least where he knew the berm to be, for he could see nothing. Shocked awake by the blasts, the rest of Reyes' squad began to engage the unseen enemy as best they could. Realizing their muzzle flashes would give their positions away, squad members instead used grenades against the enemy phantoms out in the night. The North Vietnamese had scrambled for cover when Jian opened up. Now it sounded like the 2 groups were on opposite sides of the earthen berm. The NVA seemed unsure of where their attackers were. Shouts in rapid Vietnamese mixed with the screams of the wounded, "Chu hoi! Chu hoi!" The wounded NVA soldiers were desperately trying to surrender. "Chu hoi my ass," a nearby soldier hissed. Squad members, Sean included, tossed grenades toward the cries until no more were heard. The air stank of spent explosives and spilled blood. Concussed from the explosions and flat on his side in the mud, Sean could barely grasp the surrounding chaos. Sergeant Reyes had taken an AK-47 round through his throat. Squad medic Tony Antonelli was frantically working on him. Johnson was on his radio, with battalion operations in Cu Chi, calling for a medevac helicopter and extraction for the rest of the squad. He was told to hold tight as firefights were raging elsewhere and dust-offs were working feverishly to evacuate the wounded. The men squirreled in as low as they could get in the muddy field and waited, each man fully wired and wrestling with his own demons. They were low on ammunition and expected the NVA to return with a vengeance before the night was out. They prayed, each in their own way, to make it to sunrise alive. Reyes died within the hour. The round had damaged his carotid artery, and there was little Antonelli could do to staunch the bleeding. Back in Boston, Jessie Reyes would leave a fiancé, a mother who would never recover from her loss, and 4 young siblings who would miss their brother dearly in years to come. The squad wasn't extracted until morning, after the company's commanding officer flew out to survey the battlefield and determine enemy body count. Several blood trails were found running north away from the ambush site. The NVA had policed up their wounded and dead, all except one, and withdrawn. With a blood-red sun cresting the horizon, Sean approached the body. It was the column's point man, who had been the first to die. Searching the dead soldier, he found nothing of intelligence value on him. Instead, he discovered a single letter in a parchment envelope, carefully folded into a small satchel that held the man's identity papers. Inside were 2 photos of a pretty Vietnamese girl wearing a white silk áo dai and a bright smile. Part of Sean wished he hadn't looked. Another part of him knew he must remember her face, even if the memory of this cruel night haunted him for the rest of his days.